Hi, I'm Patrick Lyons, a graduate student in the University of Maryland's iSchool program. I'm proposing a study on the evaluation of copyright management in libraries with a special focus on those who have e-reserves programs. Copyright management has been studied in library and information science for a long time, and there's a lot of published research on the topic. It's especially important for libraries that offer electronic reserve services due to how fair use assessments impact the workflow of reserves work, bogging library staff down and ensuring copyright compliance to the point that it affects service quality. However, despite all the attention copyright management has received, researchers have been unable to develop a database of performance metrics for the various approaches libraries use. Without knowing how libraries implement copyright management, it's impossible to evaluate different approaches in respect to one another. There's no data to derive benchmarks from, no resources to consult if you want to know how different approaches compare, and nothing to recommend one method over another apart from some very general guidelines. Previous efforts like Hansen, Cross, and Edwards' 2013 study attempted to address the problem but were frustrated by extremely low response rates. Here's the text of the Fair Use Doctrine according to the Copyright Act of 1976. The four factors are what must be considered and applied to every copyright item before they can be placed on reserve. So this is what library staff are obligated to consider on a case-by-case basis. If taken to court for copyright infringement, they need records of how they reached a decision to use something without securing permission from the rights holders. I'm proposing a longitudinal, repeated measures study consisting of 3 phases, which can be reiterated to improve the results. It's a mixed method sequential explanatory design, which starts with Phase 1, email and mail-based surveys. That data is analyzed and followed up with Phase 2, targeted, semi-randomly selected phone or web conference interviews. Finally, Phase 3 is targeted, semi-randomly selected on-site research, conducted in person, where a researcher would observe or take standardized measurements of copyright management performance. Each phase builds on the data from the previous phases, and the entire design can be repeated to generate more data, which would improve statistical power, ensure reliability, and eliminate confounding variables. Here's a diagram illustrating the phases of a study and the length of time each phase is expected to take. With this study, I'm attempting to address 5 research questions. 1. How and by whom are current e-reserve copyright policies developed, updated, and implemented? 2. What are current copyright and licensing practices related to actual implementation of these policies? 3. What, if any, reactions have those policies or their implementation received by stakeholders, such as publishers and rights holders, external to the institution? 4. Are there significant differences in copyright management policies and practices based on library size and/or library type? And 5. How do libraries' implemented copyright management practices compare to one another in terms of performance? The proposed study will establish a body of data on professional practices in copyright management and electronic reserves, with standardized measurements to make comparative analysis easy. It will provide data on how rights holders react to various copyright management practices and policies. It will provide data on general practices and/or software systems that libraries use to manage copyright and electronics reserves programs. It will enable libraries to evaluate their own copyright management methods and provide data-driven recommendations on how to manage copyright, as well as help libraries determine which software system would best meet their needs where applicable. Finally, it would allow libraries to more efficiently and effectively assert the fair use doctrine without exposing them to copyright infringement. I conducted a literature review using repeated searches in various federated search engines and in the University of Maryland's library catalogs. I found mostly case studies and books about the history of copyright, general copyright management guidelines, and comparisons of software systems used to manage copyright in e-reserves operations. Using different terms netted some additional results, as did working backwards from citations within other sources. As mentioned previously, the bulk of the literature are case studies which don't discuss how their approach to copyright management compares to those of other institutions, and which are too specific and possibly too subjective to use for comparative analysis. I also found 7 or 8 books which were about copyright law or the history of reserves, which had some basic universal recommendations for copyright management. They were too broadly focused to be of much use in comparing ways to manage copyright, though. I also found some books comparing the features of different software options for eReserves programs, but they didn't directly address how they compared to one another in terms of performance either. The most relevant study I found was a 2013 study by Hanson, Cross, and Edwards of copyright management in eReserves among libraries belonging to the Association of Research Libraries, or ARL. They sent surveys to 125 ARL member libraries and obtained excellent data on copyright policies and how they're created, who administers copyrighted libraries, and what sort of reactions from publishers and rights holders libraries experienced. They weren't able to obtain much information of eReserve's administration or the implementation of copyright policy due to very low response rates. They chalked the low response rate up to a combination of libraries being unwilling to share performance data and/or libraries not having the data because they don't keep records or performance metrics. They concluded that libraries prefer to surreptitiously evaluate their programs rather than communicate openly and directly, and in general struggle with copyright management evaluation. In order to overcome or mitigate the low participation rates Hanson, Cross, and Edwards experienced, the proposed study will first cooperate with and/or integrate members of professional organizations into the research team to leverage their pre-existing connections and contacts, their relationships with their member libraries, and their knowledge of potential participants. Second, it will get around issues with record keeping, non-standard metrics, the unreliability of self-reported data, and confounding variables by using the third phase, in-person, on-site standardized measurements, either by observing their records or, with permission from the participating library, establishing performance tracking and record-keeping processes. Third, the study will expand its sample to all types of libraries to cast a wider net. Finally, the study is designed to be repeated over time, so more data can be generated, reliability can be tested, and confounding variables can be eliminated. The study is a mixed methods design so as to gather as much data as possible. It will collect quantitative data such as the number of courses in an eReserve system, the number of items on reserve, the average time it takes to process items for reserve, the average time they spend on fair use assessments, the average time they spend trying to get permission for items on reserve, and etc. It will also collect qualitative data like title, documents, themes, the type of software they use, etc., in order to put the quantitative data in context and to develop an overall theoretical framework of what the best practices in copyright management are. The first phase will use the standard 0.80 for statistical power. In the first phase, emails would be sent to all of the libraries identified through the professional organization's member lists, as many libraries as possible. It's hard to estimate how many libraries would ultimately participate, although the ALA estimates that there are 120,000 libraries of all the different types in the US. If half responded, then the total sample size would be a little over 60,000, way more than would be needed to ensure statistical power. The second and third phases would both use the same sampling strategy, randomly selecting participants within categories based on the size and type of library. The total sample sizes can be modified by adjusting the frequency of selection and the semi-random sampling to strike a balance between a manageable number and maintenance of statistical power. The procedures for the first phase are essentially mailing surveys to all the libraries from the professional organization's members lists. The surveys would solicit data such as the name and title of the participant and the name, type, and estimated patron count of their library, whether they have a copyright policy, when that policy was created, last reviewed, and last updated, etc. Here's a mock-up of a survey that could be used in the first phase, and in the bottom right, a table showing its factors and powers. The second phase, the phone or web conference interviews, would primarily be used to gather additional details on the data from the first phase, as well as asking what the circumstances and outcomes of contact with rights holders were, and whether they record performance measures, and would make them available to the research team. Here's a mock script I made for the interview phase with instructions to minimize observer effect and control for confounding variables. The right side also has a very basic mock-up of what sort of coding could be used to analyze the data from the second phase. The third phase's procedures are basically having someone go to the participating library and either get the information needed for the study from their records or set up methods of collecting that data. Specifically, the study would be looking for things like the number of items on reserves, the number of courses, the number of items processed in an academic semester, etc. The first phase is estimated to take 3 to 6 months. The second phase should be about 6 months to a year. The third phase will take between 1 and 2 years depending on sample size, and the data analysis will likely take another 1 to 2 years. A conservative time estimate would be 5 years for one iteration of the various phases in the study. Costs for the first phase include SurveyMonkey Gold licensing for the open-ended question feature, and so participants don't have to struggle with filling out a document and emailing it back, as well as postage. In total, the first phase costs about $350. The second phase would use HyperResearch software to analyze audio recorded from the interviews and to facilitate development of a codebook to identify themes when analyzing the qualitative data. The total cost for the second phase is around $650. The third phase is inarguably going to be the most expensive due to travel and accommodation costs, as well as salaries for researchers. Potentially, cooperating professional organizations will defray those costs by having their staff conduct the on-site research. They may also be helpful in obtaining grants or other funding. About 20 copies of Microsoft Excel will be needed as well in order to organize and analyze all the quantitative data. Data in the form of answers to close-ended questions, data from iPads, data from professional organizations, data from library websites, and performance metrics will be analyzed using the standard alpha of 0.5 power and effect size of 0.50. All quantitative data will be analyzed and reported as descriptive statistics and entered into Excel databases of rotating tables for easy access, organization, and to facilitate statistical testing such as MANOVA or multifactorial analysis. Data in response to open-ended questions, documents given in response to the survey questions, and the qualitative data gathered from the second phase will be coded by emerging themes and inducted into overall analysis with the help of HyperResearch software. The major limitations of the study are the very high costs and amount of time it needs, although the benefits are correspondingly large. If the study in its entirety is too unwieldy, it could be broken up into multiple studies instead, and the data could be pooled and integrated afterwards. Another limitation is that, although expanding the sample to all library types is good for improving statistical power and makes the results applicable to all libraries, it may also introduce too many confounding variables to control for. This is another area where the study could be broken up into smaller studies if participation is sufficient with the other measures introduced in the proposal. Finally, it bears keeping in mind that this study only concerns itself with the rights holder's perspective through second-hand accounts of interactions. Other studies would need to gauge how rights holders react to various copyright management methods in order to get the full picture. That's the end of my presentation, and these are the works I consulted in its creation.